Have you ever noticed that the more you try to explain yourself, the more control you seem to lose over the situation? We've been conditioned to believe that arguments persuade people and that logic wins debates. But reality often works differently. The more you speak, the more power you give away. Carl Jung understood this well. Silence is not a lack of action. It is a form of control. When you learn to remain quiet at the right moment, the other person begins to reveal themselves. In this video, you'll discover why truly intelligent people don't rush into arguments. They observe, they wait, and when they finally speak, their words leave a lasting impact. So stay until the end to understand how to use this silent approach to gain real power. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Have you ever left a conversation feeling like you lost, even after explaining everything? You spoke, justified yourself, and tried to prove your point. Yet deep down, it felt like something slipped away. That happens because silence is often more valuable than any argument. Speaking impulsively may feel like control, but in truth, it's in silence that people begin to truly listen. We live in a culture that often mistakes talking for strength. The more someone speaks, the more correct and in control they appear. But the opposite is also true. The more a person feels the need to explain themselves, the more insecure they may seem. This is where silence reveals its power, not as absence but as presence. Silence that comes from within is not withdrawal, it is mastery. Carl Jung once said that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves. And few things are as frustrating as the silence of someone who refuses to react. That silence forces us to confront what we are projecting onto them. Silence acts like a mirror, while words often distract. Those who speak excessively try to control the narrative. Those who remain silent hold their position. There is a kind of power that doesn't shout. It observes, waits, and moves only when necessary. It is the power of someone who no longer feels the need to prove anything because they have already accepted their truth. A person who truly understands themselves doesn't engage in every conflict, not out of fear, but by choice. In this sense, silence becomes a form of strategic intelligence. It is not empty, it is selective. It separates what deserves a response from what is merely seeking a reaction. It disarms others because it offers no resistance, while also exposing those who crave control. People who depend on control often feel unsettled by someone who doesn't react. This reversal confuses them. They expect confrontation. They rely on back-and-forth exchanges and verbal tension. When they encounter silence, they lose direction. They begin to justify themselves, reveal insecurities, and get lost in the space left unfilled. However, true silence is not an empty tactic. Its power only exists when it comes from inner completeness. It is not used to manipulate, but to support what doesn't need to be spoken. Some truths cannot be explained. They are felt in the calm presence of those who live them. And it is within that quiet inner space, and free from noise, that real strength becomes visible, steady, clear, and undeniable. Remaining silent is not a sign of submission. It is the opposite. It is a conscious decision made by someone who understands that reacting impulsively leads to losing their center. There is a refined emotional intelligence in choosing not to respond, a quiet wisdom that communicates more than any argument. The one who observes before speaking listens more deeply, not just to words, but to what is being hidden beneath them. Silence slows your internal pace. While the ego wants to win, silence seeks to understand. While impulse wants control, silence looks for clarity. Jung said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This idea is powerful because those who fail to recognize their triggers become controlled by them. Talking excessively is often one of those triggers, the urge to react immediately, to be right, to explain everything. In many cases, this is the unconscious trying to maintain control. But with awareness comes a pause, and that pause, even if brief, is a space of power. In the gap between what you feel and what you say, your true self begins to emerge. Those who develop this awareness realize that many provocations don't require a response, because they are not directed at the self, they are directed at the ego. When the ego is calm, it doesn't engage in unnecessary conflict. Emotional intelligence is not about always having the right answer. It is about knowing when no answer is needed. It is about tahammul, holding the discomfort of silence without rushing to fill it. It is understanding that those who shout often lose the ability to listen, while those who listen, even in silence, remain ahead. Of course, this level of silence requires practice. It demands that you unlearn the belief that staying quiet means losing. It requires you to face the internal discomfort of not reacting. But over time, silence becomes a safe inner space, one where nothing needs to be defended, and energy is saved for what truly matters. Then, when it is time to speak, your words come from a centered place, clear, direct, and without excess. Because those who master silence do not speak to prove a point. They speak to create impact, with precision rather than urgency. Much of what we say comes from the ego. The ego is quick, reactive, and eager to assert itself. It wants to explain, defend, and control perception. It fears silence because silence offers no certainty, no narrative to rely on, no distraction to hide behind. And yet, this is exactly where the deeper self begins to act. In Jungian psychology, the self is the core of the psyche. It does not compete with the ego, it goes beyond it. While the ego seeks recognition, the self seeks alignment. While the ego is noise, the self is presence. And presence does not need to prove itself, it simply exists, often in silence. At this level, silence is not emptiness, it is awareness. It is the ability to resist the pull of ego-driven impulses, to listen without reacting, to observe without losing yourself, to choose without being carried away. It reflects someone who can distinguish between a wound asking for attention and a truth asking for space. Think of the image of a wise king. A true king speaks little. He doesn't need to raise his voice to be heard. His presence alone communicates authority. And when he does speak, his words carry weight. Not because he seeks approval, but because they come from deep reflection and understanding. He speaks only when there is something meaningful to say. The ego, on the other hand, always wants the final word. It speaks to ease its own insecurity. The more wounded it is, the more it justifies itself. The more afraid it becomes, the harder it tries to control the narrative. But the self does not need that. It observes, waits, and acknowledges internal reactions without identifying with them. This distinction between reacting and observing is subtle but powerful, and it becomes most visible in silence. When you choose not to respond, not out of fear, but from clarity, you demonstrate psychological maturity. You show inner authority. Speaking less in such moments does not mean losing your voice. It means gaining depth. It allows your words to come from a place that doesn't constantly need to defend itself. When the self replaces the ego, speech becomes intentional, and silence becomes strength. Not every reaction comes from the present. Many responses are shaped by old wounds that have not yet been understood. When someone challenges or criticizes us, it is common to react strongly, defensively, or even excessively. In such moments, it is not just your present self responding, but a wounded part of your psyche being triggered. Jung referred to this as a complex. Complexes are emotional patterns stored in the unconscious. They carry their own memories and reactions. When activated, they can take control of behavior, making us respond as if we are reliving past pain, even when the current situation does not justify it. For example, someone with a deep sense of injustice may react intensely to even a mild accusation. They may respond with anger, sarcasm, or withdrawal. Their tone changes, their body tightens, and their arguments escalate. In reality, they are not just reacting to the present. They are protecting an old emotional wound. Jung explained that you don't eliminate a complex by fighting it. You dissolve it by becoming aware of it. And that awareness begins with silence. Instead of reacting immediately, you pause. And in that pause, you ask yourself, who is speaking right now? Is it my conscious self or an old wound trying to defend itself? In this sense, silence is not just the absence of speech. It is active internal awareness. It is noticing your body, your tension, the urgency rising within you. Because when the impulse is strong, it often signals that something deeper is being triggered. And if you respond without recognizing it, you remain under its control. When a complex grows stronger, it feeds on unconscious reactions. But when you choose silence, not the kind that suppresses, but the kind that observes, something begins to change. You start separating what belongs to you from what belongs to the past, and what truly needs to be expressed from what only wants to burst out. The complex no longer controls you. It becomes something you can understand. This is where emotional freedom begins. You realize that not every reaction needs to turn into words. Not every pain has to become a defense. In this sense, silence is not weakness. It is clarity. Only those who can hear the inner voice can consciously decide what is truly worth saying. Much of what we express publicly does not come from our true center. It often comes from the image we've created to be accepted. Jung called this image the persona, the social mask we wear to function in the world. It has its purpose. It protects us, smooths interactions, and helps us play our roles. But sometimes, it speaks too much. When someone talks quickly, with excessive certainty, seeking admiration or validation, it is often not the true self speaking. It is the persona trying to maintain itself. The persona of the intelligent one, the fair one, the spiritual one, or the always balanced one. It needs to preserve its image. To do that, it explains, defends, and proves. Meanwhile, the shadow, everything we have suppressed, denied, or ignored, remains silent. That is why real silence can feel unsettling. In silence, there is no role, no script, no argument, only what is real and unfiltered. And often, this is exactly why silence is avoided. It exposes what the persona tries to hide. Jung believed that confronting the shadow is unavoidable for anyone seeking authenticity. Deep silence, the kind that comes from presence, is one of the most powerful spaces where this encounter happens. In silence, the persona fades, and the shadow begins to emerge, sometimes as discomfort, scattered thoughts, old fears, or hidden guilt. This is why many people fill silence with words, not from confidence, but from fear. In silence, control weakens, and what surfaces is not always neat or pleasant. but it is real. When you start noticing when you're speaking from image rather than presence, something shifts. You begin to listen to yourself, and through that awareness, you choose what truly needs to be said. At that point, silence becomes a mirror, one that others may not fully understand. When you speak less but remain fully present, your presence challenges the masks of others. That is real power. Not the power to manipulate, but the ability to remain unaffected by what is unnecessary. There are people who enter a room and, without saying a word, change the atmosphere. Not because they try to dominate, but because their presence is enough. They don't rush to explain themselves or prove their knowledge. They simply exist, and that is sufficient. This kind of presence is not built on ego. It comes from the inner silence of someone who no longer depends on being seen to feel complete. It is the opposite of performative charisma. It doesn't compete for attention or try to impress. It simply exists. And for that reason, it naturally earns respect. It reflects a mind that has found stability within itself, one that no longer needs to rush outward because it is grounded inward. Jung noted that the unconscious responds more to symbols than to explanations, and silence is one of the strongest symbols. It suggests depth. It hints that there is more beneath the surface. It creates space that encourages others to adjust themselves. In silence, a truly present person begins to guide the energy of a room, not through control, but through balance. This power does not come from what is said, but from what is maintained. And to sustain it, one must have done the inner work of recognizing their worth without relying on external approval. Those who constantly feel the need to explain themselves are often still uncertain about who they are. Those who remain silent with confidence have moved beyond that doubt. In this context, silence is not just the absence of sound, it is the absence of need. It is the stillness of someone who has listened deeply enough to no longer depend on responses. And that stillness is not cold. It is clear presence without excess, a contained yet noticeable energy, almost like quiet tension. Others can feel it, even if they cannot explain it. This is the difference between presence and performance. Performance seeks attention. Presence changes the environment, and that cannot be learned through technique. It develops through depth. When you can sit in silence without feeling the need to justify yourself, you don't just become free, you become a reference point. Not because you tried, but because your silence communicates more than any effort to persuade. Not everything we communicate is through words. In fact, much of our presence is expressed through the body, posture, breathing, rhythm, and eye contact. Even before speaking, we send signals that show who we are, how we feel, and whether we are centered or not. When the ego quiets, the body begins to express more truth. This silent language is subtle, yet powerful. A well-placed pause, a steady gaze, a relaxed but grounded posture. All of these create impact. It is a form of authority that does not shout, but settles naturally. It does not demand respect, it receives it. Emotionally balanced individuals do not rush to explain themselves. They have rhythm. They speak by choice, not by pressure. They wait, they listen, and even in silence they communicate clearly. I don't react, I choose. This kind of communication carries strong meaning because it reflects inner mastery, and those who master themselves are rarely controlled by others. Jung recognized the importance of nonverbal expression. For him, everything in the psyche has symbolic form, including how the body expresses itself. When the ego is unsettled, the body reveals it. Restless hands, a hurried voice, tense posture. But when the self is in control, the body relaxes, and this calm is naturally perceived as confidence. So silence is not just the absence of speech. It is alignment between inner state and outer expression. When the body is free from the need to defend itself, it begins to communicate trust, and trust is felt before it is explained. Whoever masters their body can influence the atmosphere, not through manipulation, but through presence. This is the difference between someone who tries to convince with words and someone who convinces through their being. The body expresses truths that speech sometimes hides. That's why external silence is not enough. You must also quiet the inner noise. This kind of silent communication cannot be imitated. It develops through consistent self-awareness, through not rushing, through pausing before acting, and through understanding that not every response needs to be spoken. Often, what truly transforms a situation is the presence of someone who, in silence, remains grounded, like someone who knows exactly who they are without needing to say it. It is difficult to discuss silence as a form of power without mentioning The 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene. When I first read it, it challenged my perspective on silence and speech. At times, it even felt uncomfortable, but over time I realized it simply reveals patterns that already exist, just often unnoticed. One idea stayed with me, simple yet powerful: say less than necessary. At first, it may seem like basic advice, but it carries deep psychological meaning. According to Greene, speaking too much can expose you. When we speak impulsively, we reveal insecurity. When we over-explain, we give away more than needed. When we try to convince others with excessive words, we may actually be trying to convince ourselves. In this sense, speaking less is not about hiding, it is about protecting. It is about observing before acting and not revealing everything too quickly. Strategically silent people create space. They allow others to speak, to reveal themselves, to fill the silence with their own projections or mistakes. Greene explains that silence positions you. Yes, it can make others uncomfortable, but that discomfort is what gives it strength. Silence reflects inner control in the person who holds it. And interestingly, the more the other person speaks, the more they often expose themselves, especially if they are trying to dominate or manipulate through words. This understanding of power is not just social, it is deeply psychological. When you master silence, you begin to master your ego. You no longer feel the need to respond to everything, prove everything, or explain everything. You choose when and how to speak, and that gives your words real weight. Jung spoke of inner presence, while Greene speaks of strategic presence. When these two come together, silence becomes not just a habit, but a form of power. When these two perspectives come together, you get a form of silence that commands attention without ever raising its voice. But it's not only Greene or Jung who support this idea. Ancient Taoist wisdom expressed it more than 2,000 years ago. Lao Tzu, an old Taoist master, said, "He who knows does not speak. He who speaks does not know." In Taoism, silence is not inaction. It is a connection to essence. The wise do not need to prove their worth. They act with presence, and that is enough. In this sense, silence becomes a form of harmony with the natural flow of life. Speaking excessively means moving against that rhythm. Blaise Pascal, the 17th century mathematician, philosopher, and theologian, once wrote that all of humanity's problems come from the inability to sit quietly alone in a room. For him, Silence was a gateway to self-knowledge. The inability to remain still, internally or externally, reflects a restless mind disconnected from itself. According to Pascal, real balance begins when you can be alone with your own presence without needing noise to escape yourself. And many others, philosophers, spiritual teachers, neuroscientists, therapists, have reached similar conclusions in different ways. Silence, when rooted in awareness, is power. It is an invisible tool, a key to inner authority. Perhaps the most striking insight is this: the more you quiet yourself internally, the more the world pays attention to what you represent externally. Silence has a disarming effect. It acts like a mirror. When you don't react, the person speaking begins to hear themselves more clearly. When you don't fill the space, they reveal more of who they are. By stepping out of the exchange, you indirectly guide the situation. This is not passivity. It is a deep psychological strategy. Many expect confrontation, arguments, or resistance. When they are met with silence, they lose their direction. Some try harder to provoke. Others become tangled in their own words. Silence disrupts the expected pattern. It removes them from their role and forces them to adapt. And in that process, their masks often begin to fall. A well-timed silence is not withdrawal. It is spatial control. You don't impose, you occupy. You don't pressure, you attract. But this requires presence. Silence driven by insecurity feels different from silence grounded in clarity, and people can sense that difference. Silence from a wounded ego is avoidance. Silence from the self is centered awareness. Carl Jung spoke about the transcendent function as the integration of opposites. When there is an inner conflict between reacting and remaining whole, silence creates the space for that tension to evolve. Instead of choosing one side, you hold the tension, and from it, something new can emerge. This applies to relationships as well. When you don't rush to explain, convince, or argue, you allow the other person to reveal their own inner patterns. In many situations, when one person stays silent, the other, uncomfortable with that silence, begins to contradict themselves, justify unnecessarily, or expose things they didn't intend to reveal. This is not manipulation. It is clarity. It is understanding that not every interaction needs to be played like a game. Sometimes, maintaining silence holds more power than winning an argument. Often, the one who remains silent with awareness holds the higher ground, not to dominate, but to stay centered. The same silence that disarms others also reveals something within you. In that quiet space, you begin to realize how little you actually need to react, and that realization brings freedom. However, not all silence feels empowering. For many, silence can be uncomfortable or even painful, not because there are no words, but because the emptiness brings back something unresolved. In such cases, silence can activate old wounds: abandonment, rejection, exclusion. What should feel like a pause begins to feel like a threat. The urge to speak, explain, or fill the space becomes a form of self-protection. Some people feel uneasy in silence because it exposes what they once experienced, being ignored, unheard, or unseen. That inner tension does not disappear over time. It simply changes form. It can become compulsive talking, anxiety in relationships, fear of loneliness, or fear of being misunderstood. Jung explained that healing begins with accepting what is, and learning to accept silence is part of that process, not as emptiness, but as a space where true listening can occur. For those carrying emotional wounds, silence is not easy, but it can be transformative. Because in silence, you begin to tolerate your own presence without resisting it. The fear of silence is often the fear of hearing the body, the emotions, the unanswered questions. But avoiding it only keeps those patterns alive. It is in silence, when the outer noise fades, that the inner voice begins to emerge. Even if that voice feels uncertain, it deserves attention. Self-mastery begins here, not by controlling emotions rigidly, but by allowing space for them to exist. Remaining silent in the face of provocation is difficult. Remaining silent while facing your own past is even more challenging. But even a small moment of choosing not to react can begin to break that cycle. In this way, silence becomes an act of courage. It is a quiet statement. I am here, and I am willing to listen. And when you do, something starts to shift internally. The intensity softens, fear becomes manageable, and silence no longer feels threatening. It becomes a gateway. Because when you stop avoiding yourself, your voice returns in a new way. It no longer comes from urgency or fear, but from wholeness, and that changes everything. In the end, silence is not simply the absence of sound, it is the presence of self. It reveals what remains when you stop trying to convince, explain, please, or win. What remains when you simply exist. And as simple as that sounds, it represents a deep process of self-understanding. Only those who have truly listened to themselves can hold silence without fear. Many still associate silence with weakness, with having nothing to say or losing an argument. But real strength lies in not needing the final word. And those who feel compelled to speak constantly are often trying to protect themselves. Those who remain silent with awareness are not hiding. They are grounded. Jung once suggested not holding on to anything that constantly needs to be defended. This applies to opinions, identities, and personal narratives. If something requires continuous justification, it is still unstable. Silence, on the other hand, belongs to those who have moved beyond that need. It reflects what is steady, integrated, and whole. True silence appears when the ego quiets and the self takes the lead. There is no longer a need to react to everything, explain every action, or prove your identity. There is only a conscious choice to remain present, and to let your energy communicate what words do not need to. This silence is not retreat. It is intention. And it is not escape. It is positioning. It comes from within and remains steady, even when the outside world demands noise. It knows when to wait, when to observe, and when to act. And when it finally speaks, it does so with precision, because every word carries meaning. To understand silence is to understand yourself without needing external validation. It is choosing where your attention goes, rather than reacting to every situation. It is protecting your inner peace instead of handing it over to every external trigger. And perhaps this is the simplest, yet most powerful insight. When you can remain silent in the face of provocation, doubt, or neediness, you realize how much you have grown. So the next time someone tries to provoke you, disrupt your peace, or push you into reacting, pause, stay silent, and ask yourself, who is louder right now, you or your ego? If this message resonated with you, if this perspective on silence connected with something within, consider subscribing to the channel. Turn on notifications to keep exploring psychology, awareness, and a form of intelligence that doesn't demand attention, but transforms everything. And if you stayed until the end, leave a comment below. Silence is intelligence too. It's a simple phrase, but it shows you didn't just watch, you understood. And now, I'll see you in the next video.